Right now, very pleased to have with us writing at Forbes, Frank Miniter. How are you, Frank?
Good, Cam. Good to talk to you.
It's good talking to you too, sir. Tomorrow, April 15th, as you say, more than the tax deadline for an estimated 1 million New Yorkers. It is the deadline to register their quote-unquote assault weapons and high-capacity so-called magazines. If they don't, they will be breaking the law.
Living outside the law. It's amazing. When I talk to gun owners here, I'm in New York State, and before the SAFE Act was passed, I would ask them, we talk about guns and AR-15s, whatever they had. Now if you ask them about it, they get evasive, their eyes start to change. And they don't want to talk about it very much. It's become very different. We're just pushed out of mainstream society by this law. That's why there's such a big movement against it, bigger than I've ever seen. I interviewed recently Tom King, the president of the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, and he says he can't think of anything in his age, maybe in his grandfather's age, maybe Prohibition had this big of a movement against it. It's so horrific.
As you say, one of the big questions is how many people are actually going to comply with this. And you've talked to people who've decided that they see this as an act of civil disobedience, of not registering their firearms.
And that million number isn't a guesstimate. I mean, the National Shooting Sports Foundation used NICS checks and surveys and many different criteria to put it together and figure out there must be about 1 million people in New York State who at least have these types of firearms when the SAFE Act was passed. So potentially there are 1 million people who are not registering these firearms. In the state, I've tried to get them to answer the question, how many have registered? Connecticut answered that question and got a lot of bad media, and I think they didn't want that media off of this because they're not answering the question, how many people have registered their so-called high-capacity magazines and so-called assault weapons. And, of course, an assault weapon now in New York State could be your Model 1100 Remington shotgun with a pistol grip on it.
Yeah, well, you look at the SAFE Act and all of the provisions as passed. I know you talk about the repeal efforts. Frank, I gotta say, I would love to see every lawmaker running for office in New York asked why they don't support a repeal of the SAFE Act, given the fact that the 7-round limit was struck down, right? The ammunition registry and the ammunition background checks, state police don't know how they're going to administer it. I don't know when it's going to go into effect. Basically, what this law became was a gun ban. The only people impacted by this are currently law-abiding gun owners as of April 14th. They're the only ones impacted by this law. Why on earth would you want to keep it on the books?
Yeah, the politicians, they don't want to talk about this, and the state police doesn't want to talk about this. A lot of counties have actually passed ordinances saying they're not going to enforce it, and the majority of the sheriff's departments here in New York State say they won't enforce it. But for the most part, politicians, they don't want this to be an issue. They don't want to talk about it at all. They would rather it just went away.
Yeah, well, I'm sure
they're not enforcing it. They're not out there trying to. The other provision is things have already come into effect, and they haven't really pushed to try to enforce those provisions either.
Right. No, I know. I have a feeling a lot of these lawmakers in New York wanted to cast that vote. They bought into what Governor Cuomo told them. Oh, they're gonna love you for this. You're gonna break the gridlock here, and you're gonna show them that we can really get something done here in New York. And it's been awful. It's been an awful law, and they don't want to go back and talk about it because a lot of them voted for it, and they have to answer for that. But the way to make it better is to repeal it. You can't avoid your votes on this awful piece of legislation.
No, and that's why we need to keep talking about it, and why I'm hoping it gets more media. A lot of people looking at it on Forbes. I think it's surprising them to see that 1 million people potentially have been cast out and turned into criminal law-abiding people, and suddenly turned into potential criminals by the state for really, and of course, it's an awful law. It's a liberties-infringing law, but it's also a really stupid law, like the ammunition registry you mentioned that they passed. They wanted to piggyback that on the NICS system, on FBI's federal background check system. But by law, by federal law, they couldn't do that. But they didn't even do the research to find out they couldn't do that. That's how much they embarrassed themselves with how fast they passed this restriction, the SAFE Act.
Talking with Frank Miniter from Forbes about the New York SAFE Act. Now, there are, and again, I don't know how many politicians want to even talk about this to bring it up for a repeal vote, but the case is being challenged, or the law is being challenged in court.
Right. It's already had one court hearing, and most of it was upheld. That 7-round capacity, you can only put 7 rounds in a 10-round magazine, that was thrown out as arbitrary. Since it's been appealed by the NRA and the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association. up to the next level, to the circuit level. So, on goes the fight.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, Frank, I appreciate you coming on the program. I'm sure it's good talking to you again, and look forward to doing this again soon.
Anytime, Cam.